Okay, so we criticized the integrated assessment models and in the last podcast, and we also talked about how models may be playing an unintentionally a part in the politics of prevarication by using technologies for future projections like negative emissions and carbon capture and sequestration that may serve political needs to delay mitigation. But the good people who work with IAM's integrated assessment models, or climate policy models as they're referred to by some, do think about how to improve them, and they're aware of some of the limitations that they tend to be technocratic, economic, and not so much behavioral in terms of including human impacts, politics, political economy, financial system into tracking future pathways. So they agree that, similar to many economic tools developed decades ago, IAMs are built on an oversimplified logic that people are rational optimizers of scarce resources. Agents, that are entities who have the autonomy and the willingness to act, agents make decisions that maximize the benefits to a country or a society. This is an assumption. Price adjustments, for example, a carbon tax, or constraints on polluting technologies alter the agent's incentives, yielding changes in behavior that alter economies and emissions. Even as the climate bill in the US is playing out, and how Democrats have essentially abandoned the carbon tax for other incentivizations and regulation-based approaches, this is obvious that IAMs would not work in that situation. So in reality, human choice is a darker brew of misperception and missed opportunity, constrained by others' decisions. In general, systemic decisions are handed down, and they tend to constrain people's ability to choose, like insurance needed, environmental tax, carbon tax, offsets, whatever may be involved. Researchers in sociology, psychology, and organizational behavior have long studied human behaviors. They explore why people stick with old, familiar technologies even when new ones are much superior, for example. This kind of research can also explain why the passion of mass movements such as the global climate strike movement, Fridays for Future, is hard to understand based on just individual costs and benefits, yet it can have powerful effects on policy. So when something like Fridays for Future comes along, they cannot be ignored just because of the number of people involved and their scale at national levels or international and global levels. It isn't clear if such movements survive the test of time, but while they're going on, they can have an effect on policy. There is a science paper which then argues why including the financial system in IAMs would be necessary for effective climate policy, and it provides a couple of good cartoons, or schematics I should say, for making the point. So linking climate mitigation pathways and the financial system, so they suggest these kind of methodologies. An integrated assessment model generates economic output trajectories under climate policy scenarios. A climate financial risk model uses IAM output to compute interest rates for firms using different energy technologies, represented here as K, investors' expectations, and climate value at risk, climate VAR. Determine capital allocation across technologies. IAM updates to reflect diversity of financial costs. So this is about coupling IAMs to CFR climate financial risk model. So you have financiers, banks, politicians, funds, insurance companies involved in the financial system, and they may be able to accelerate the policies and decarbonization, for example, or they may see risks as a reason for delaying and fighting climate policies. So we'll see what that means in a minute. So just briefly, we are looking at time, country, and socioeconomic activity and energy choice, for example, and looking at carbon price, investment, and output in the IAM context, whereas if you use output from IAM to CFR, you worry about investor expectations, interest rates, and capital allocation, and then you feed it back to IAM. So you have some kind of a coupled system which is argued to be a better tool for decision making and policies in this paper. And they further go on to show that the interplay between the financial system and climate policy timing can be critical, and without including the financial system, this will be missed by IAMs. Okay, so 4 main IAM climate transition scenarios are shown here. Solid curves are the same in the top and bottom panels, which is in the next slide, and represent stylized trajectories from existing integrated assessment models. So these are just schematics. This is for electricity production from coal and renewable energy. So they are IAMs are looking at the potential benefits, costs and benefits, without going into the financial aspects. Dashed curves represent stylized trajectories from the IAM climate financial risk framework of electricity production and asset values. The difference between solid and dashed curves is the effect of accounting for the role of financial system into climate policy. So we're looking at just trajectories from IAM scenarios of renewables and coals, and then looking at the same things from IAM CFR framework. So if the financial system together is enabling, in other words, favoring the climate policy by somehow seeing the risk as beneficial to them if they support the transition to renewables, let's say. So schematically speaking, this climate policy is introduced here. If the financial system is enabling, then both the IAR and IAR CFR tell you that coal will be phased out. With CFR, it may the trajectory will be different, even though the exact phasing out may be about the same in terms of timing. But if you look at the renewables, you can see that just the IAMs may take this trajectory, but including the financial benefits as seen by the enabling financial system would accelerate this, even though by 2050 you may still end up in terms of the same energy output. So you accelerate this, and there are hysteresis effects, so you would reduce pollution and replace coal with renewables faster here, so the warming that you end up with may be different by 2050 in the two pathways. So the asset values are looked at as well in the IAM CFR framework, where coal becomes less and less viable, whereas asset value of renewables keeps going up and hits some plateau at 2050. Very schematic. This is the immediate climate policy. If there is a delayed climate policy scenario, let's say you wait for 2030, then depending on the financial system's perception of risk, you will end up going in this direction for energy output from renewables versus the IAM scenario, and the IAM scenario would just put coal in play for a longer time, whereas an enabling financial system, when coupled with the IAM, may indicate a pathway that's dropping off coal much faster with similar drop in the asset value as well. Of course, the financial system could be a hampering system where dilly-dallying and delaying and lobbying for delaying policy can go on, and this is happening already in the US, where one of the political parties is actually in many ways punishing states and industries which are trying to take climate action. So this is a rough game, obviously. That's the real system, which IAMs don't include: the political economy, the political calculations. So global negotiations may be driven by people who are good at bringing people to the table and agreeing on a decarbonization pathway, but the actual decisions have to happen within the country, where policies and pathways may be much more dependent on politicians who may see carbon tax as not a viable political option, but regulations like fuel efficiencies and other things as better in terms of knowing who will pay the price and how that will affect the election outcomes, etc. So again, looking in the hampering financial system, energy output for immediate policy starting here, you see now IAMs go much faster than what the real system does, because in the coupled IAM CFR, the hampering financial system would delay the energy output from renewables because they will keep coal in play for much longer, whereas IAMs will say it will drop off faster and the asset values show similar impacts. Whereas if there is a delayed climate policy, then you can see that IAMs again in a hampering financial systems are optimistic about energy output in the beginning, and the IAM CFR system would see less energy output from renewables and more energy output from coal for a longer time. And similarly asset values look at that. Okay, you get the idea. So this paper, Nature paper, which talks about improving climate policy models, or the need to improve them by including more realistic people or more realistic human behavior, thinks of 8 political economy insights. Data improve models' relevance to policy and investment choices, obviously. So I'll just read them off. Access to capital can be constrained by risk-averse investors who fear unpredictable changes in policy, hampering low-carbon energy transitions. So this is the hampering financial system. The design and type of policy instruments, such as whether to subsidize green technologies or tax polluting industries, can be influenced by which interest groups are mobilized. Carbon lock-in and standing of fossil-based energy assets might limit the degree to which emissions can deviate from their previous trajectory without interventions that can weaken the power of incumbent polluters. So carbon lock-in is a real thing. Just for example, in terms of the industrial complexes that are in place to produce internal combustion engine cars, if you want to switch to EV, you have to do something with them. So there is a lot of carbon lock-in involved in those kind of things, for example. Unequal costs and benefits of climate policies accrue to different economic, racial, and religious groups, the climate justice issue and equity issue, which can affect policies' moral and political acceptability. So even if a policy is agreed upon by political parties and the system, public acceptance will be affected by perceived or real racial and economic and religious inequities. Public opinion might facilitate stronger action to tackle climate change, which is seen in the US, for example. Confidence in political institutions or lack of it can influence public's willingness to support actions that reduce emissions. So people may just think if carbon is taxed, then government will just take the tax and spend it on other things. So they may not just trust the political institutions. Trade and investment policies can expand the markets for new green technology, leading to lower costs and more political support. Doing this to me, I'm sorry about that. If this is an HP Elite box, whatever, if somebody knows why it suddenly goes into sleep mode, please message me. Okay. Trade and investment policies can expand the markets for new green technologies, leading to lower costs and more political support. So there is some evidence of this in terms of Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft going to net zero, planning for net zero, having their own renewable energies, and so on. So there is a push towards looking at the message from public's demand for green technologies and making investments ahead. There's a whole movement called impact assessments, where people want to invest in green technologies and so on. Competence of government influences a state's ability to intervene in markets, make choices, and alter the cost of deploying capital. So US's climate bill, which is affecting large aspects of renewables, transportation, efficiencies, buildings, etc., infrastructure is going to play a role like this. So finally, there is a phase diagram here shown on how to improve models. The integrated assessment models used in climate science need improvement. They must better predict how policies to reduce emissions might influence industry, labor unions, and voters, or vice versa. Updates the models vary in how easy they are to implement and how useful they will be to different stakeholders, obviously. And the supplemental of this paper provides a table of specific model parameterizations and representations and so on. Here is the schematic showing stakeholders and areas for reform. So looking at analysts interested in emission trajectories, national policymakers, international policymakers. Obviously these are not always the same in terms of their goals and strategies and demands. Areas for reform in the models include effect of government quality on policy efficacy, openness to cross-border trade and investments, again socio-political decisions, distributional effects of policies across different groups, so economic, religious and racial equities, for example, age structure of existing energy assets, so that you have a way of instead of investing and improving a fossil fuel power plant, for example, can you phase it out based on its age structure, and so on. Okay, so the phase here looks at usefulness, so that goes to things like how easy they are to implement and how useful they will be to the different stakeholders. So least useful and most useful on a scale of 1 to 10, and on this you have ease of modeling 1 to 10. So least useful may be hardest to model, and most useful may be the easiest to model. I don't know. Sorry, we are still least useful. So least useful models may be hardest to model or easiest to model, but it's not very useful. So you want some kind of a mid-level usefulness, and if you head towards most useful, then you're probably going to end up here where ease of modeling is going to decrease, but usefulness is going to go up for all these stakeholders here. And data on aging power plants can reveal how quickly national emissions can change. So just think of ease of modeling and usefulness. Here the role of good governance is difficult to encode, so that would increase the difficulty of modeling or reduce the ease of modeling. Well, you get the sense that there are multiple things to consider in improving the models, and especially in terms of including human behavior, political issues, governance issues, financial system issues, and so on, and risk perceptions in general, which affect human behavior, which can be climate friendly or unfriendly. Okay, so in the other context, we have talked about in general the idea of why the system itself needs to decarbonize, but this is about how to decarbonize, how to get there. So it still matters, because going with the paradigm of reducing emissions hasn't been very effective and is argued to be really not a good way to go. So if decarbonization is a better way, then how do IAMs play into this requirement into the future for providing better policy where human behavior and climate finance risks are included? That's kind of the general point. I just wanted to include it following immediately the criticizing of IAMs. So hopefully this is helpful, that people are thinking about improving climate policy models or the integrated assessment models. Okay.